Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, Chapter 1, Halacha 5 in the Art Scroll. We're on 12b2. This is part 1 of this year. And today we're going to be getting back to what happens if you're separating olives for olive oil or grapes from wine. We covered this earlier in Chapter 1 where it was saying the reverse. It was saying if you're separating olives for olive oil. Now, we saw here that that's going to be a derabanan fence that even goes back to maybe before Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, or maybe at that time. It's not a deraita thing, it's a derabanan fence that they put up, that you have to give the Kohen the finished produce. You're not supposed to just give him some grapes and say, go do something with it, go make some wine. No, you're supposed to go give him and process the grapes. Now, we're going to be getting into, in part 1 of this year, why is it like that? What is the mechanism of what's going on with this fence? And we're going to have two opinions. We're going to have Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. And one is going to be saying that what we were saying earlier in chapter 1, that, well, yeah, the theft is an issue. We don't want to steal from the tribe of the Goan. What would be the issue with stealing with the tribe of the Goan if you gave, grapes instead of the wine? Well, pressing a lot of grapes, you have a lot of loss. You have the skins, you have the seeds, you have a lot of the flesh that doesn't actually get turned into wine. And now you've given him something smaller. So if you're going to separate out 2%, well, what are you separating out your 2% from? What about all the flesh that wasn't used? I mean, it was squeezed, but it's not edible. What about that? Well, that's a loss from the tribe of the Goan. And so they're saying that you're supposed to give from the finished product. We're going to get a new opinion here. The new opinion is going to be saying that it's going to be for preserving the waters from the mayim paraduma, from the water for purifying from the red cow. And the maloket between why this fence is here, this rabbinic fence is here, is going to be between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi in part 1 of this year. Basically, Rabbi Meir is saying, yeah, that's true that we worry about the theft, but really what we care about is going to be for the water. We really care about preserving the water, not wasting the water. And Rabbi Yossi says, no. It's not really for wasting the water. We care about theft. We care about this loss. Now, normally in a maloket between Rabbi Yossi, the Tana, and Rabbi Meir, it's going to go by Rabbi Yossi. But this is an unusual set of Gemaras, and this is going to go by Rabbi Meir. Why? Because Rabbi Yochanan is going to be saying that, the reason why is because of the waters. Now, I'm going to explain to you what's going on with the waters. We don't want a case where the food processor, we're not talking about preserving the waters for the Kohen who's going to eat this. We're talking about for the food processor, the guy who grew the grapes. And we don't want him just handing some grapes when he's tahor and saying, okay, you go deal with it. Okay, here's a few grapes and I'm not going to make the wine. I just gave you some grapes and finished. Goodbye. Instead, we want him to go and purify himself, to do it in a state of tahara, to go to the Bet Hamikdash to get purified with the mayim parodema, and to make sure he's doing everything in a state of tahara where he is pure and tahor, and then to make the wine. And that way that he's doing it in a big batch, and he's giving it all at once. He's not giving like a couple of grapes here and there where the Kohen really can't do anything with it. So there's a lot that also gets paralleled here in the Mishnah and also in the Gemara here as a brisa that comes up in Idios. Idios is going to be the malokets between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, where Bet Hillel is strict and Bet Shammai in every aspect is lenient. So this is a complicated set of halachas, and the Gemara really took a lot of work for me to come up with to understand it. So the Mishnah goes like this. It says, one may not separate olive oil as truma on behalf of olives that will be crushed, or wine on behalf of grapes that will be pressed However, if he did separate truma in either of these circumstances, his truma is valid truma, but he must separate truma again. So the idea here is that although the truma is valid under biblical law, the rabbis are saying that the olives have to be made into the oil, and then you're separating the truma from the new oil. And the Gemara is going to explain why this applies, that you have to go separate this again, and what's going on with it. Now, the Mishnah is going to note two halachic differences between the first truma that you're going to separate and the second one. So the Mishnah says the first truma renders the other produce a meduma. That's going to be a forbidden mixture of truma and chulin on its own. So inside, basically, it's saying it's a mixture, and it's a dumua, and it's unusable. And because you can't identify which part is the truma and which part is the secular chulin, you have a problem with it, and using it's a problem. And the Mishnah continues and says, and a non-Kohen is subject to the penalty of an additional fifth for accidentally eating it. This, by the way, is going to be where if a non-Kohen accidentally eats truma, he's going to separate a quantity of produce equivalent to what he ate, plus a surcharge. That's going to be the fifth, and that's going to consist of a quarter of the value of the truma. And again, there's a system of measuring from within and from without. So even though it's called a fifth, it's really adding 25% extra penalty to it. This, by the way, is prescribed in the Torah. The Torah prescribes this. And they're saying over here that in this case, for the first truma, that's the mixture, because there is some truma in there, and you can't figure out which part is chulin and which part is truma, that you're going to have to pay a penalty for inadvertently eating it. The Mishnah continues and says, in the following case, it's permitted to designate, it says, but these laws do not apply to the second truma. So if you're going and separating the olives for the oil, you're not supposed to do it. But if you do it, you're supposed to separate out truma again. And the first time you've separated out truma, they're saying that this is a mixture. And if you inadvertently eat it, you pay a penalty. And if you separate out the truma again, there's no penalty on this second pile that you separate out. Now, the Mishnah says, but one may separate oil as truma on behalf of preserved olives, or on wine on behalf of grapes that he intends to make into raisins. So, in contrast to the olives intending to make it into oil, and the grapes intending to make it into wine, which, by the way, are not processed, then you have preserved olives and raisins, and those are going to be processed. So in other words, we're talking about preserved olives, and we're talking about raisins which are preserved, and that's a form of processing. So, by the way, when you're making raisins, it even undergoes hechsher. Hechsher is going to be the process where it can become temeh, and it can become impure. So the raisins themselves are not considered processed until they're heaped up into a pile. And then, but it is finished, and it's a finished product. So you're separating one finished product on behalf of another separate finished product, even though they're a little bit different. Very interesting. And it says, or on olives on behalf of olives that are intended for eating. So if he separated truma from olives that were intended for other olives, and then he looked at them in the finished state, and then he's doing it on olives that is not made into oil, but they're finished olives, and they're pickled or they're preserved. Then that's a finished product, and then that you can do that. You can take the olives that are just off the tree, and then take it for the preserved olives. It doesn't have to be olive oil, but it has to be a finished product. That's the idea. It says, or grapes on behalf of grapes that are intended for eating. This is going to be, like the raisins. And it says, and he considers, and it says, and then he reconsiders and decides to press them. He does not need to separate truma again. So if somebody separated wine as truma for grapes that were intended for eating, or he separated truma for grapes intended for eating for other grapes, And then after he separated the truma, he decided not to eat the olives or the grapes, where the truma was designated. Rather, he wants to crush them now for oil, so that these olives are actually now unprocessed when he made the separation. So you might have thought that the separation is retroactively considered for the unprocessed olives. And what this is teaching us in this case is he has to separate out an extra truma. So the Mishnah is teaching that actually that's not the case. Since the olives were considered processed at the time of designation, and the designation was permitted then, it remains effective despite the change. So in other words, let's say you had finished olives, and then you decided, I don't want the finished olives, I'm going to turn it into olive oil instead. Well, we're not going to make you, go through all of these rules like you're taking olives off the tree and separating truma from that instead of the oil. At the time that you designated it, it was a finished product, and that's going to be fine. So this needs to be in here because you wouldn't know this otherwise. You might have said, well, and you might have applied and rationalized, the last set of laws, and you might be right. That's why this Mishnah needs to be in here. So we go by, what is the status of this when we're separating out the ties? Is this a finished product or not? And the Mishnah concludes, and it says, one may not separate out truma for something whose processing is completed on behalf of something whose processing is not completed. And over here, an example might be that one may not separate kernels of grain that have been smoothed into a pile, and the stage of grain at which grain is considered processed on behalf of grain that's not yet been smoothed, which is when, smoothing it is when you, have it, set for tithing. And it says that, or from something whose processing is not completed on behalf of something whose processing is completed, or from something whose processing is not completed on behalf of something whose processing is not completed. So the Gemara is going to present these laws. It seems to be extra that if you had a processed produce, that it may not be designated as truma for unprocessed produce, and the other way around. And the Mishnah is going to be teaching that this third clause is not needed to teach that this designation is prohibited, but to teach that the truma is valid after the fact. And that's how the Mishnah is going to rule. So it's going to say that, but if they did separate truma in these cases, the truma is valid truma. So although he transgressed a prohibition, the truma that he separated is valid, and furthermore, there's no need for him to separate truma again. And again, this is going to be a rabbinic fence that's put in there, and that's why if this were a deraita thing, then it would not be valid. But because this is a rabbinic fence, and if he did it, but you shouldn't do it. So the Gemara is going to look at this contradiction between the beginning of the Mishnah and the conclusion, and it says there at the end of the Mishnah, we just learned that one may not separate truma for something whose processing is completed on behalf of something whose processing is not completed. And the Mishnah is ruling that if you did it, the truma is valid after the fact. So since it does not state otherwise, the Mishnah must be implying that if one one does not need to separate truma again. But here in the beginning of the Mishnah, you say it does. In other words, the beginning of the Mishnah said the opposite, that oil, processed produce designated as truma for olives, which is unprocessed, becomes truma, and you have to separate out tithes again. We just learned it, so what's the difference? And the Gemara answers. It says, Rabbi Hillel said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the beginning of the Mishnah requires a second truma separation because of the rabbinic decree for protecting the water of the chatas. That's going to be the para aduma water, the red cow water. And he's saying that it was enacted so that the water of the chatas would not become defunct. In other words, the rabbis were trying to prevent the chatas water, where the Kohen needs to purify himself so he can eat truma, from falling into disuse. And who are they targeting? They're not necessarily targeting the Kohen, who's the end user. They're targeting the producer. They want to make sure that the producer is going to be making the finished product in a state of tahara and giving the finished product in a state of tahara. How does he do it? He has to go get the, purified from the Kohen. He can't just separate out a few grapes, here and there, give to the Kohen, and say, okay, good luck, bye. And they're saying, no, it needs to be finished. And you have to give them a finished product. Why? Maybe because of the loss, But Rabbi Yochanan is saying, no, the primary reason is because they want you to be using the water so that it stays in use. Everybody's going to be tahor, and that you're producing in a state of tahara, and you're giving to the Kohen in a state of tahara. You're not just giving a couple of grapes. Now, if I take a couple of grapes and it doesn't become wet, and I just hand it to the Kohen, well, I don't need to worry if I'm tamei or tahor because it doesn't have hechsher. It's not wet, and it can't become tamei yet. But the wine is wet. It can become tamei. So because wine is one of the 7 liquids and oil is one of the 7 liquids, if I'm handling it in an incorrect way, or even my pinky touches one part of the barrel, the whole part of the barrel that's exposed now is going to be tamei. Can't use it. So they were trying to make sure that you're protecting the water. And again, there's 2 issues. One is going to be disqualifying. Rabbi Yossi is going to be disqualifying and saying that the rabbis wanted to do this to prevent theft from the tribe of the Kohanim. In other words, they were worried about when you're processing it, there's going to be a loss to the Kohen. And the other view, which is going to be that, no, they're doing it to protect the chatas water. In other words, to make sure that you're going to get purified, and you're going and you're not just handing a couple of grapes that you don't need to worry about tahara for. If you hand them a couple of grapes and you say goodbye, that you're giving them the wine, and now you have to go out and use the chatas water. So the Gemara is going to ask a question. Say, which is stronger? Is it going to be that the decree is to prevent theft from the tribe? In other words, this rabbinic decree, where did it come from? Why did the rabbis do it? Was it because they were worried for theft of the tribe, which is a real thing? I mean, it's part of it. Or is it going to be for protecting the chatas water? Now, again, Rabbi Yochanan said it's going to be for protecting the chatas water. It's Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say, let us learn the answer from the Brisa. It says that if someone separated truma from olives on behalf of olives, and he's going to crush all of them, or grapes on behalf of grapes, he's going to press all of them, it's valid truma. But if the truma was lost, he has to separate truma again. In other words, that since it is valid truma, there'd be no reason for a second separation unless it was no longer available. And in other words, you're saying that it's lost. So, in other words, he separated truma that he intends to crush, and the other olives he also intends to crush. But if it's lost, it's not there anymore. So what does he do? So he's saying he has to separate truma again. And the Gemara says, in this case, there are grounds for preventing theft from the tribe because the Kohen loses by receiving the olives. In other words, there's 2 explanations for a theft of the tribe. One is going to be the burden of processing the truma. It's going to be put onto the Kohen, and the amount of truma is going to, could be less than required because again, you're pressing it, you have a loss, and you could say that you've taken away from the Kohen, and he's getting really less than 2%. And then the other way of the loss is that the Kohen has to go through the trouble to crush the olives himself, and he can't do it on a big scale, and he's not set up to do it. And then the amount, you're taking away from his time. And, if you're going to go and produce, a big vat of, pressing all at one time, you're going to get economy of scale. And just coming to go press for a couple of grapes, there's no economy of scale anymore. And same with some olives. So, you've taken away from the Kohen's time. And also, the issue is that he can't produce as efficiently. So the quantity he's going to get, even on the smaller amount, is going to be smaller. And then also the other issue is that you're going to say, well, there's also the loss of, pulp and skins and things like that. And, you're putting that into the calculation when you took out your 2%. But after you've gone through the processing, he actually gets back less than 2%. So that's also going to be a way to look at theft from the Kohen. So the Gemara says that, in this case, there are grounds for preventing theft from the Kohen, from the tribe of the Kohanim. And there's also grounds for protecting the water of the Chatas. Why? Because if the original truma is lost, then the decree is enacted to prevent theft of the tribe. That's going to be calling for the original truma to be invalid. But the decree to protect the Chatas water is going to call for it to be valid, and then for a second portion to be separated. So the Gemara says, and the Brisa taught in this case, that if someone separated truma, he must separate truma again. This calls us that the decree for protecting the chatas water is stronger than the decree, which also is valid, from preventing theft from the tribe. In other words, Marafulda explains it like this: that the Brisa's case for separating truma from olives on behalf of olives is not the same as the case of the decree for preventing theft from the Kohanim, because the Brisa does not apply the decree for preventing theft from the Kohen. That would disqualify the truma. And in other words, it's looking at the status of the truma. And so the Brisa's case is also different from the situation where the decree for protecting the chatas water, where you're separating oil on behalf of olives, and in this consideration, they did not prevent the Brisa from applying the decree for protecting the chatas water. And so in this case too, the decree for the chatas water seems to be the stronger of the two. That was the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is basically saying that the chatas water is the big deal. And Rabbi Yossi is going to be saying that, no, it's really going to be the theft that's the big deal, why the rabbis instituted this. So Rabbi Yossi stated that according to Bet Hillel, the olives designated as truma on behalf of oil do not become truma. So the Gemara is going to ask, how does Rabbi Yossi rule for this Mishnah's case where oil is designated as truma on behalf of the olives? In other words, that you've done the opposite case as what we learned earlier in chapter 1. And the Gemara asks and says, what would Rabbi Yossi say here in this opposite case? And this Mishnah is teaching that if you separated truma for oil on behalf of olives, the truma is valid. But if you lost it, somebody must separate truma again, so that the chatas water will be used. And basically, is Rabbi Yossi going to be accepting that? Gemara answers. It says, now if Rabbi Meir, who rules leniently regarding the decree of preventing theft from the tribe, in other words, he does recognize it, but he's saying the primary reason to do this decree is not to prevent the theft from the Kohanim, which is also valid. He does say that it's valid, but the reason is to make sure that people are going and getting purified before they process all of this. Now, again, the point that Rabbi Meir would say is that if I cut off a few grapes, from the vine and give it to a Kohen, it never underwent hechsher, so it can't become tamei, and I don't need to worry if I'm tamei or not. I gave to the Kohen and finished. But if I'm making the wine, I do need to worry if it becomes tamei, because I can't make my wine tamei and go and separate it and give it to the Kohen. So if Rabbi Meir, who's ruling leniently, says the Gemara, for preventing theft from the tribe, but ruling stringently for protecting the chatas water, in other words, making sure that the processors are going and using it before they make the wine to give the truma from the wine to the Kohanim, then Rabbi Yossi says this Gemara, who rules stringently regarding the preventing of theft from the tribe, would he not also rule stringently for protecting the chatas water? And so the Gemara challenges that conclusion and says the following brisa was found that teaches in the name of Rabbi Yossi that one may not separate truma from olives on behalf of oil or grapes on behalf of wine. But if one did separate such truma, his truma is valid truma. He doesn't need to separate out a second truma. And these are the words of Rabbi Meir. However, Rabbi Yossi says in this brisa, Bet Shammai rules that one may separate truma in either circumstance. In other words, the Brisa's version of Bet Shammai's view differs from the version that we talked about earlier in chapter 1, which is stating that Bet Shammai forbids separating truma from olives of oil. But, by the way, this is also going to be in the Mishnah in Idios in chapter 5, Halacha 2. But basically, Rabbi Meir does accept the decree of, the primary reason of this being for chatas water. But regarding truma that's lost, it does have to be replaced. And Rabbi Meir does not subscribe to the decree concerning theft from the Kohanim, but he does agree that, if the truma is lost, it has to be replaced. So the Brisa continues, says, whereas Bet Hillel rules that one may not separate truma in these situations, and everyone agrees, in other words, Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel agrees, that if one did separate truma, one does not need to separate a second truma, even if the first is lost. Now, the Tana of this section, Rabbi Yossi, is referring to separating truma for olives on behalf of oil, since that's the subject of the Bryce's previous section. But it looks like Rabbi Yossi might be contradicting himself, and this is a very difficult sugya. So here he's ruling that one who separates truma from olives for oil does not need to separate truma again, which would indicate that the truma was valid. Yet in the earlier part in chapter 1, what we covered a couple of days ago, Rabbi Yossi would be disqualifying this truma. So to avoid a contradiction, we have to say that Rabbi Yossi refers here to a different case, namely separating truma for olives, for oil on behalf of the olives. And in other words, the theme of this Mishnah is going to be the opposite case of what we were learning before. There you're dealing with an unfinished product for a finished product, and here you're dealing with a case of separating for the finished product for the unfinished product. And over there, they're saying that you can't do it, and it's not valid. That's what Bet Hillel says. It's not valid. But over here, what they're saying is a little different. They're saying you can't do it, but if you did it, you did it. So the Gemara is gonna say that this seems to be contradictory, and Rabbi Meir rules leniently on theft from the tribe, but here he's ruling stringently on protecting the chatas water. But Rabbi Yossi rules stringently on the theft from the tribe, but he's ruling leniently on protecting the chatas water. In other words, his primary reason for why this decree is going to be for saying that we want to make sure that if there's a loss to the tribe in the processing, the tribe of the Kohanim in the processing, that the person's making it up, and that's the primary reason why we have this enactment. Rabbi Meir is going to be saying something that is echoed by Rabbi Yochanan later on, so it seems that this is going to be like what Rabbi Meir is saying, which is unusual in itself, and it's going to be like we're doing it to make sure that people are going and processing in a state of tahara and going and becoming tahor with the water. So the Gemara quotes another Mishnah for designated olives as truma for oil, and it says that we learned a Mishnah there over in Idios 5.2. Rabbi Yossi says like this: 6 matters are counted among the lenient decisions of Bet Shammai and the stringent decisions of Bet Hillel. First is that fowl meat, that's going to be from like a chicken or a duck, may go up on the same table with cheese, but it may not be eaten together with cheese, and that's in accordance with the words of Bet Shammai. Now, Bet Shammai maintains that the entire prohibition of eating fowl cooked with dairy is rabbinic as a precautionary measure so that somebody doesn't eat the domestic animal meat like a cow with dairy. By the way, birds don't produce milk. So Bet Hillel says that fowl meat may neither go up on the same table with cheese, nor it may be eaten together with cheese, by the way, let alone cooked in the milk. And it says that one may separate truma for olives on behalf of oil or grapes on behalf of wine in accordance with Bet Shammai. This, by the way, is the case that we're covering. And Bet Hillel says one may not separate truma in either of these circumstances. So since the Mishnah stated only that Bet Hillel forbids separating and does not add that they also disqualify the truma, it's implying that Bet Hillel deems the truma to be valid. So the Gemara is going to explain it like this. Rabbi Mana says there should be no mention in the Mishnah here of separating truma for olives on behalf of oil. Rather, the Mishnah's case is the opposite. It's where you're separating truma for oil, which is going to be the finished product, on behalf of the olives, which are the unfinished product. And again, that's different from the case that we learned earlier in chapter 1. So according to this look, the implication that the truma is valid pertains only to separating the truma for oil, for olives, and not separating out truma for the unprocessed olives on behalf of the finished oil. And the idea says because it's following the view of Rabbi Yossi. And Rabbi Yossi says if one separated out truma for olives for oil, his truma is not valid truma. So Rabbi Yossi is quoting Bet Hillel for disqualifying the truma for olives for oil. But in the Mishnah of Idios, Bet Hillel is implying that this truma is valid. So the Mishnah in Idios does not refer to truma separated from olives for oil, which is going to be the unfinished for the finished, but rather it's going to be talking about oil for olives. And this version is reflecting the beginning of our Mishnah here, which forbids one to designate oil as truma for olives, but rules that the truma is valid after the fact. And so then it says, the next part of the Mishnah, it says if one separated truma from oil on behalf of the olives that will be crushed, it's valid truma, and he must separate truma again. Now, the Gemara is going to limit this obligation to separate a second time, and we're going to be getting into the more of that case tomorrow. But basically, the idea ultimately is going to be like what Rabbi Yochanan said. It's going to be like Rabbi Meir. It's not going to be like Rabbi Yosef. Basically, the idea is that if you're separating out the finished product on behalf of the non-finished product, it's valid after the fact. Why is that valid after the fact? Because if you did this in a state of tahara, where you went and you got the hatas water, you're pure, and you can only process truma from oil if you're pure and give it to a kohen. So it seems like that's going to be the primary reason. That, in other words, you have to go to the Bet Hamikdash to go use the mayim paro dama to process it. And so then, if you went and you separated out for some olives, which by the way, are right off the tree. They didn't go hechsher. They didn't undergo hechsher yet. They're not necessarily subject to becoming temeh. They're saying you're not supposed to do it that way, but if you did it, you did it. And in other words, what did he do? What did the guy do? The guy took the olive oil and said, I'm taking and processing the truma on my olive oil for my olive oil, and also this pile of olives here, and here's the extra amount. And Rabbi Yosef is basically saying, well, we're our primary thing for why we don't do it is we're worried about theft. We're worried about that there's going to be a loss in processing, or a loss of the kohen's time, and that's why we don't go and do it. But if you did it, you did it. Now, in the other case, they're going to be saying, everybody's going to be saying, like it's Bet Hillel, that it's not a valid separation at all. But again, over here, how do you get to the fact that we have this whole thing dealing with, yes, there is a loss to the tribe of the Goan in the background, but the primary reason is going to be the usage, to keep the usage up of the mayim paro dama, the red cow water. Why is that? Because when you're dealing with the oil, you have to be tahor, and so that's how we're deriving this whole system in either case. And in the other case, if you're just taking out some olives and giving him the olives instead of giving the oil, you could say that okay, well, it's the loss of the kohen, and you wasted the kohen's time. He has to process something that's inefficient in a small quantity, and he has a loss because you're giving him 2% of something that he loses when he turns it into the oil, and he's actually really just getting less. But the deeper reason for why that is to say, no, wait a second. The real reason why we have this is because if you just gave some olives, the guy doesn't need to worry if he's tamei or tahor. But if he's making the oil and handling the oil, now he has to worry about it. And so that's why in the other case, they're forbidding it. And in this case, they're allowing it after the fact, even though you're not supposed to do it. Have a great day.